What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. Today's video, we diving into some more decks that I came across in my looking up on for Magic the Gathering, seeing what people are playing, talking about a few of the new decks that I just find interesting, of things that people are playing outside of the current meta as a whole, and what they're doing to kind of combat against the meta as well. And these decks each have their own unique philosophy on how they're kind of doing it and what they each bring to the table to kind of help play something that's a little bit anti-meta against the meta. As we all know, Rogues is like one of the more dominant matchups, as well as like the mono reds and the the green stompy style decks. But Rogues is one of those decks that's just very annoying. It takes advantage of just dumping a lot of cards into your graveyard, which makes it definitely a pain in the butt to definitely get cards that you definitely want out of the graveyard. But each of these decks, like I said, each have a mechanic that kind of hopefully help combat this kind of thing. With that being said, guys, if you like this video, hit the like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you want to know when I post more videos, hit the subscribe button. I know I've been a little bit on the lacking on the consistency of uploading recently. I just been not for better terms, but I guess in a weird way, I've been really addicted to playing World of Warcraft again, just because of the new expansion coming out, and I for some reason just want to play World of Warcraft all the time. And not trying to make an excuse, but I should probably try and make more videos and play a little less World of Warcraft. But with that being said, let's dive into the decks and let's talk about each one and see what they each bring to the table. All right, so first and foremost, before we kind of get into this and go over the first deck, which is the Selesnya Landfall deck, I saw a comment in one of my other videos, and someone was actually asking how to turn this to this view, so you can kind of like look at the cards this way. So essentially all you're going to do is actually just kind of click this top right hand here, and it says change deck layout, and you just click like this. It's going to put it down here, so you can kind of see like what collection you have to kind of put into your deck, and you're just going to kind of post it, push it up like so. So if you just wanted to know, that's just a quick heads up. Hopefully that answers the question in case anyone you guys have it. I know this is not technically explained to anybody, but it's one of those things that always help out in case someone has a question. So this first deck is Selesnya Landfall, and essentially it is kind of like a landfall-y kind of rampy style deck. As you can kind of see here, there's kind of the usual suspects in here for a landfall style deck, as well as there's the usual suspects in here for more of a ramp style deck. And what this deck is essentially trying to do, we're just trying to ramp up really heavily and trying to just kind of overwhelm our opponent by playing a lot of big things. So as you can see here, Skewed Swarm is one of the cards in the deck that kind of like is one of those cards that if your opponent doesn't deal with it in a certain way, it kind of becomes a problem, especially once it gets to turns when you have 6 or more lands on the battlefield, because essentially you're just making more copies of Skewed Worm. And as you can also see here, we have the Great Horn kind of sneaking in here as kind of like the secret mutate card that you're actually gonna probably put on Skewed Worm in the later game as you get higher and higher, because once it goes to turn 6, you're now going to make copies of Migratory Great Horn, which essentially is just going to help you make even more big creatures. And every time you play a land, you are just going to essentially just make even bigger creatures. So that is one way that we're kind of trying to go over the top against our opponents. The other card here that I find interesting as well is actually this Fearless Fledgling. Sure, it's a 1/1 right now for 2 mana, and it's nothing too crazy. It's uncommon. It doesn't have flying all the time, but once you actually play a land and the land comes into the battlefield, you get a +1/+1 counter on it, which doesn't get removed. So now it becomes a 2/2, possibly even more. And then it also gains flying. So every time you play a land, you gain flying. Breath of Meletis is one of our ways we're going to search up for some lands. We got Cultivates in the deck to search up for more lands. We got Dryad to play multiple lands on a single turn. Also making all our lands any color, which helps us with our our more expensive, like higher end cards, as you kind of see here. Just because it's 3 and 3. Also some of the doubles, like the Ashia Soul of the Wild, which is actually also a pretty good card here, because it gains power and toughness equal to the number of lands we control, and non-token creatures we control our forests in addition to the other types. So essentially it makes our creatures into lands themselves. So essentially we're just having a bunch of mana on the battlefield. The one way that this deck kind of plays around the milling of the rogue decks and things like that is it actually plays the Ancient Green Warden, which is a card that I feel like a lot of people are hyped up about, just because essentially it allows us to play lands from our graveyard onto the battlefield, which helps us in a way. Like, so what you can essentially do is you can just keep on reoccurring Fable Passages. Even if you run out of basics in the deck, you can kind of keep on playing Fable Passages to kind of reoccur the landfall trigger that way, as well as to kind of get some lands that maybe get milled based on playing against a rogue deck. Has reach as well, which makes it very strong. And the other thing too is if a land enters battlefield, causing a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger it, that ability triggers an additional time. So essentially anything with landfall that we have in the deck is now going to essentially trigger an additional time. So we also have Felidar Retreat, which is also a landfall ability, which I kind of didn't go over, but you know, it creates tokens or it gets +1/+1 counter each creature control, and they gain vigilance end of turn, which makes it even better. You know, it's just you know, we get the Asheran, which is a card I feel like a lot of people, you know, forgot about, but he's actually pretty good because it helps us ramp a little bit, and it also makes our opponent not allowed to pay life or sacrifice a non-land permanent to cast spells or activate abilities, which is also very good. There's not much of the way of sacrifice at the moment, but there's a few things that will definitely you know, definitely help out by slowing our opponent down by, you know, using this ability. And then, you know, I got the Stone Coil Serpent because, you know, multicolor protection, and also getting +1 counters for the cost of X, so it's like a mana dump ability, but it's also a good solid early game thing in case we need it. But overall, like I said, this deck is pretty interesting in what it's trying to do. We're just trying to ramp up very heavily, trying to take advantage of the landfall ability. I haven't really gotten to playtest too much of it, but like I said, it's fairly interesting in that way. The sideboard is there in case you want. You know, it's got a few things like Crypt to get rid of things, you know, exiled target graveyard. You got some giant killers. You probably could add a couple more of those if you really wanted to. Just go with 3. It's Chainweb Arcaner, just in case you played traditional Magic. This is actually very good against like the decks that have a lot of flying, just because it has reach. It can be escaped for 5 mana, which exiles 4 cards, which escaping helps us get rid of some of our graveyard to, you know, not have our opponent take advantage of it. Heroic Intervention to give our things Hexproof, which I feel like this is another card that kind of was very hyped up about. A lot of people played it in green decks, but I kind of feel like it kind of went away as much, but definitely a very good solid card. Magra to slow down our opponents if they're playing a lot of spells or attacks with a lot of creatures. And it has lifelink, which is very good. And Gem Razor, of course, in case you play against any decks that have like artifacts. But overall, like, this deck here is pretty good and straightforward. I mean, it should definitely win you some games, and I feel like the idea of playing like a landfall style deck is pretty interesting. And I think it definitely could work. It's just gonna be tricky in certain matchups. So like it looks a little bit slow against, like, you know, the mono reds and things like that. But if you get the right cards, you could definitely probably take advantage of any deck you probably play against. So definitely a cool deck to look at. So this next deck up is a 3-color ramp style deck, or Nia Ramp. I actually have a deck already in my like thing that's called Nia Ramp, so I couldn't call Nia Ramp to have another copy of it. But essentially what this deck is, we're playing Zoraida, the Dawnwalk Waker, as our companion, actually, as well as we're playing copies in our deck. Each permanent starter deck has an active ability. Activate abilities that aren't mana abilities cost 2 less to activate. This, if I can't reduce the mana abilities, cost less than 1 mana. So essentially what it does, it turns things like, you know, Canvas abilities to be even cheaper, to make it even better, essentially making like the gain life ability just cost 1 white mana. If we have a blue mana, I don't think we actually run anything to play any of the other colors, but we do have things to, you know, essentially make, you know, his white ability cost less mana, essentially just making us be able to pay 1 white mana and gain a life, which is very good. We've got Rada here, which then this ability from going from 6 mana becomes 4 mana. It's a very solid card as well. It allows us to look at the top cover of our library and play lands from the top cover of our library, which is very good. We have a lot of like early spot removal. We got Thunder Rebuke for 4 damage. We got Fire Prophecy. We got Shock. Maze My Tome's in here, which essentially, no, Maze My Tome's not going to make you draw cards for free, but it allows us to actually pay 1 mana to draw a card instead of 2, which is very good. We got in Iron Craig Feet, which is another interesting card here. 4 mana spell that adds 7 mana and then allows us to cast 1 extra spell. So essentially what you want to do here is probably on turn 5 or so, tap this, and then you can get something out like a Ugin, the Spirit Dragon, which is very solid. Or even if you on turn 4 want to, you can also get a Chromatic Orrery, which essentially makes mana as a mana of any color, which then essentially makes Canvas abilities cost. We can pay pretty much anything, which essentially then annoys our opponents, because now we have a Chromatic Orrery out and they can't do too much on it, on the sense of the draw card ability is now also 3 mana, which is very good. Creates 5 mana. So we got some ways to really like just get really big really quickly against our opponent. It's a fairly interesting ability, this one here. The difference compared to like the other deck, it essentially doesn't really have too much on the way of it. Things go to the graveyard, what we're going to do to get it back, but we do have things to, like, you know, get Ugins out earlier, get Kenris out, you know, things that get very problematic against our opponent. The other thing that's also in the deck, which I believe also costs cheaper, is this now costs only 2 mana to put 2+1/+1 counters on target on Crawling Barrens and then have it become a creature. So it's essentially, I think, like the sneaky way to win when your opponent's not paying too much attention. Essentially now you're just getting cheaper Crawling Baron triggers, which is also very good. But like essentially this is like one of those decks that's trying to get very big very quickly and very aggressively. I think, and it's definitely an interesting deck that I think could win some games, especially with the way it is. Sideboard's pretty interesting here. You can probably tweak some things if you want to make this like definitely an easier best of one, depending on your matchups are. Yeah, Underworld Rage Hound, which I think is very good because it's a cheaper way to escape things from our graveyard. But essentially, though, in order to play it, you have to, I think, take out those Radas, because I don't think you can technically put this in just because it doesn't have an activate ability. Phoenix of Ash is very solid as well. If you want to add some flying, this is actually allowed because it has the activate ability, giving it +2/+0, and also that becomes only 1 red mana to give it +2/+0, which is very good. I got Ox in here if you want to get like very anti like mill style, throw things in your graveyard style decks. So definitely some cards in here that you can probably tweak in, move in and out. If you're not really a big fan of Rada, I'm sure there's some cards like, you know, you could probably throw in the Phoenix of Ash. You could probably throw in, you know, the Ox if you really want to. But overall, pretty interesting style deck. Like I said, you could probably play this more of a Boros style deck if you don't really want to splash the green in. But, you know, if that's the way the mana base is, but it's something to kind of mess around with, kind of see how it works, go from there. So this next deck up is kind of like this mono blue control style deck, kind of like kicker style deck. Essentially what we're trying to do is just trying to do a lot of things, kind of disrupt our opponent's early game, kind of just slow down the game in general, kind of get into our late game. As you can kind of see here, Ugin's like our big one of. We also play some Shark Typhoons. We got some Seagate Restorations that draws really, really deep. We got the Forsaken Monument, which is another interesting card here because colorless creatures we control get +2/+2. Whenever we tap a permanent for colorless mana, add additional colorless mana. And whenever we cast a colorless spell, we get to gain 2 life. So essentially, there's a few things here that allow us to kind of, you know, ramp up pretty quickly. We got some colorless mana in here that essentially will now create 2 mana to do it, which is very good as well. We got Solemn Simulacrum, which is like our colorless creature that's going to get pumped up from the Forsaken Monument. We also have the Skyclave Relic, which is also very interesting here because it's a 3 mana artifact that's indestructible, has a kicker ability that when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, we get to create 2 tap tokens of Skyclave Relic. So essentially, it's a way to ramp up pretty quickly. If you probably want to do it on a turn where you don't think your opponent's going to counter it, just because it is going to cost 6 mana to try to do it. We have some disruption spells, like I said, very, very good. Maze My Tome, which is very solid. Thassa is intervention for the counter or the possibility to like dig a little bit deeper if you're looking for an answer. The Throne of McKindy, I kind of blocking it. Let me see if I can move myself. All right, so we got Throne of McKindy here, which essentially creates colorless mana. We can tap 1 mana, put a charge counter on Throne of McKindy, then we can tap it, remove a charge counter from it, and add 2 mana of any one color. Spend this mana, only cast kick spells. So essentially, this is like our way of making us play something like the Skyclave Relic a little bit easier for the kicker's cost. I mean, you're only going to get 2 mana out of it, but if you have multiple copies of this, you're going to have, you know, multiple charge counters on this, and it's like a good way to like charge up some things. The other thing too here, which is pretty interesting, is that it's a good way to kind of like allow you to kind of like pump up, like save mana for a little bit later. We don't play too many things with kicker. I mean, we do have Into the Royal, which is another card that has kicker. We also have the Inscription of Insight, which is another card with kicker. So there's some cards in our deck that can use this in case we don't have the Skyclave Relic. But overall, it's a very interesting card that I want to mess around with and kind of see if it really works out as a whole. But I mean, overall, this deck is fairly interesting, and it has a very good strong top end. It's just a matter of if it's going to be strong enough against like the quicker, aggro, aggressive style decks that are currently in the meta. This one really doesn't have too much in the way of dealing with, you know, like the mono red aggressives in a way. Like if we can get to like turn 5 or start playing some of our stuff onto the battlefield and eventually ramp up to an Ugin, it definitely could like shift the game in our favor, but we have to get very lucky on those aggressive matchups. I mean, in the sideboard, we do have a lot of things that could definitely help us out. We got some Brazen Borrowers in case we want more bounce spells, slash creatures. You got negates if we're playing against them more spell heavy. Soulguide Lanterns in case we want to do some more graveyard disruption, which is very good. Mystical Disputes if you're playing against a mirror matchup or you feel like you're playing a lot of rogues. Mystical Disputes a very solid counter spell because they'll be playing a lot of things with blue mana. Midnight Clock's another interesting one just because it's an artifact that produces white blue mana, and then if it gets to the you know, the top of it, it will allow us to draw 7 cards. And then we got Fiora of the Sea God. It allows us to get an 8/8 blue Kraken, tap all non permanents our opponent's control, gain control target permanent. But the sideboard's pretty interesting on what it wants to do. This is probably like the one deck I think out of all of this that's probably struggles a little bit to, you know, counteract the rogue style deck, but if we can kind of ramp up pretty heavily and disrupt what they're trying to do overall, it's a very interesting style deck to kind of take advantage of, possibly, you know, being more the aggressive control deck than what our opponent's trying to do. Essentially just bouncing, you know, cards back to our opponent's hand and just making them recast it is like the way this one's trying to disrupt what our opponent's trying to do, trying to get us to this more top end style of the deck. I thought it was a very interesting style deck, and I'm sure it could definitely win some games. So this next deck up is a Asban style, mid-range style deck. Essentially what it's trying to do here is take advantage of things our opponent's dumping into our graveyard, while also being, you know, kind of like that mid-rangey, playing a lot of things that are very aggressive against our opponents pretty quickly. We got Mire trained for some, you know, two mana disruption, allowing us to get through things in the graveyard for our benefit to gain some life, as well as, you know, just trying to just, you know, 2/1 blocker is definitely something our opponent doesn't want to attack into, which is very good. Has Death Touch, which is also very solid. Though against like the mono red, it's definitely a little bit rougher because, you know, the Fervent Champion can still, you know, swing into this, and, you know, First Strike is going to kill this before it actually deals Death Touch. But something to, you know, look out for. Lotus Cobra allowing us to ramp up a little bit. Scavenging Ooze to allow us to exile things from our graveyard, creature wise, gain some life, get a +1/+1 counter. Also maybe exile just particular spells, like anything with escape that we don't want our opponent reoccurring. Very solid in that manner. Fiend Artisan is a cool, interesting card because I feel like it's one of those cards that, you know, I was a big fan of. Sorry, I punched the mic. When it first came out, but essentially against these like mill rogue decks, it takes advantage of anything that gets really dumped in there creature wise into our graveyard, because it gets +1/+1 for each creature card in our graveyard, and then we can actually sacrifice creatures on the battlefield and search our library for a card, converted mana card X or less, and put it onto the battlefield, shuffle our library, and we can only do this anytime we cast a sorcery. So pretty much on our turn in our, you know, our first main phase. But that's definitely something very good if we're really looking for some particular answer, maybe to trying to counteract whatever our opponent's trying to do on the battlefield. Definitely pretty cool. Mythos for some spot removal, allowing us to also add white or green to essentially destroy any permanent on the battlefield, or non-land permanent on the battlefield. So definitely good there. Liliana for some hand disruption, the -X/-X ability, where the number of cards in our graveyard, which is very good against like the mill style decks. Gem Razor get anti like artifact. We got some Soul Mystic Macrums for some ramp style cards. Baneslayer in here for the flying First Strike Lifelinker, protection from dragons and demons, which aren't really that particular, but the 5/5 flyer for striker is definitely very solid as well. Elspeth for that, you know, Elspeth conquers death ability for the, you know, exiling things, making our opponent's things cost 2 more, and then essentially bringing something back from the graveyard with a +1/+1 counter on it's pretty solid. Elder Gargoyle for that, you know, that flying disruption, getting some 3/3 beast tokens, getting some life, drawing cards, definitely a solid card there. Karuga taking advantage of all our big top end things. The one card I find very interesting here is the Biollante, or the Nethrai, because of its mutate ability. Whenever it mutates, it gets returned any number of creature cards with total power 10 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. So essentially, like, all our bottom end here is actually very strong. We can actually return a lot of our higher end here too to the battlefield, essentially allowing us to kind of just like get things back that our opponent's milling into the graveyard, which essentially helps us out. So very good there. You got the Massacre Worm, which is sitting over here as well, giving our opponent's creatures -2/-2 until end of turn, and whenever a creature opponent control dies, that player loses 2 life. So essentially, you know, taking out a lot of the little small weaker rogues essentially, which is very good. We got Kogla for some fighting, 7/6er, Garrick as well for some disruption, creating 3 wolf tokens, destroying target creature to draw a card, and the -6 in, hopefully to get that +3/+3 and have trample. And of course Eerie Ultimatum, because essentially if we're not dumping things into our own graveyard, our opponent's probably going to be milling things into our own graveyard. So this allows us to return any number of permanent cards with different names from our graveyard to the battlefield. So essentially getting back anything of this stuff that could have ended up in the graveyard from what our opponent milled. So definitely something to do, disrupt what our opponent's trying to do, or whatever the strategy is, and then just, you know, the basis of whatever their mana base is overall. So definitely a very interesting creature heavy deck. There's not a lot of ways of removal, but I think there's a lot of disruption that makes it very awkward for that opponent who's playing like that, you know, that rogue style deck, or very aggro aggressive deck. If we start getting into this mid-range top end area, it's definitely gonna be very hard for them to kind of win the game after that point, but definitely an interesting deck to try out and play. So essentially this next deck up is a Temur Control style deck. I mean, it's really not 100% Temur in the sense that we're really only playing one card that really requires green mana. Everything else is blue or red mana, but essentially the idea here is playing Clothis as a card that kind of like starts eating things in a graveyard to either, you know, add mana to our mana pool or otherwise gain us life and deal 2 damage to each opponent, which essentially is something that's very strong and helps and definitely disrupts what our opponent's trying to do by milling us and throwing things into the graveyard. You get some Stern Missiles for some, you know, bouncing effects. You get Cinderclasm, which I think is a card that I feel like a lot of people haven't really noticed how good it could be, because it's an instant speed Pyroclasm, and essentially you can tap it for 1 additional mana and Pyroclasm for 2 damage across the board to each creature. So definitely cheap board wipe at instant speed, which is very solid when something you don't really see. And I feel like if rogue decks still are the prominent deck, this is definitely a card that's very anti-rogue. Got negates for some counter spells. Got Slaying Fire for the little bit more aggressive burn at instant speed for 3 damage, or if you have a lot of red mana, you can definitely play for doing the 4 damage instead for some good spot removal. Storm's Wrath for the complete board wipe if you want to completely reset the board. You get Inscription at Insight, like I said in the prior deck. It's very solid. You know, return 2 target not only permanents to, or not 2 creatures to their opponent's hand, scry 2 cards, or scry 2 and then draw 2, and then target player creates an XX blue illusion token or X number of cards in hand. Definitely very good. And in the late game, you can always do all of it to do all of this, kind of completely disrupting what your opponent's trying to do. The third form, another interesting card here, because if you look at when you look at the top end here and how it gets into that kind of control style burn style deck, is that essentially that we're going to use like things like this and what our top end's trying to do to kind of like just copy things and just do additional damage to our opponent's creatures and or face. So you got Lithoform to do copy, you know, our triggered abilities, instants or sorceries, and or target permanent spell we control. We got Enthrall and Hold, which is a cool little mind control kind of card that you can cast on a creature, and now it's our creature as long as it has this ability on it. Chandra for a little bit of interesting cards to discard our hand, and then exile top 3 cards of our library. And then until the turn we play those cards, exile this way, 2 damage to any target, and then we can search our graveyard library for any number of red instant sorcery cards. Shuffle them into our library. You may cast them at 6 red mana. Double Vision, which is another interesting one here. It copies the first instant or sorcery spell. Copy that spell. You may choose new target. So essentially, any of our burn spells will then get much stronger. Fire Emancipation, which is another card that allows us to pretty much deal. If a sorcery we control would deal damage to a permanent player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent player instead. So essentially, it's going to do triple the damage. So this Slaying Fire becomes 9 damage. This Sunder and Stroke, which is the last card in the deck, is going to do 7 damage divided among us we choose to 1, 2, or 3. If 7 red mana was cast to cast a spell, deal 7 damage to each of those permanents and or players, so it can do 21 damage. So there's some cool cards on what it's trying to do here. Definitely very, very interesting. Overall, very interesting deck. I mean, it's very like board wipey heavy. Like there's a lot of things that are going to spot removal and get rid of things off the battlefield, and then you're hopefully trying to get into the double visions and the fire emancipations to kind of like finish off your opponent in one fell swoop. It's kind of like the best way we can get to what's that deck, Wilderness Reclamation in a way, but without really playing Wilderness Reclamation. It just has ways to kind of like copy spells and just do like a big one pump into the face of damage. So definitely an interesting deck to maybe try out. And then, you know, of course, you can make it more Izzet style by playing things like Sprite Dragon, Lord Dracus to maybe get more things back from your graveyard to our hand. Experiment with the Aura Lords. There's some lands in there if you want to switch up the mana base. But definitely a very interesting style deck to plan to mess around with, depending on how the matchups go and what you feel like you're playing against a lot of, to kind of like overall make it a little bit better. And the last deck up on the list is like a Golgari Midrange deck, and what the deck here is very aggressive like in the early game. What it's really trying to do, like it's got Blood Treats Thirst for some spot removal to get rid of the early drop things. You got some Heartless Axe as well for this more spot removal. We got the book, because like the book is actually very, very good, especially with like the way that Magic is kind of like the meta is shifted. Definitely a good way to draw some extra cards, gain some life, and essentially Erebos Intervention to kind of give -X to gain some life. You can exile twice X cards from target graveyards, which is also very good depending on the matchup you're looking for. Palaka Perdition is another interesting card here. You can choose a card over the command cost 3 or greater. That player discards that card. So it's a good way to from some hand removal or hand removal if you feel like you're playing more of a top end style deck where there's a lot of bigger cards. Definitely a good way there, or you can just play it for the modal land. This is a good way to get things back from your graveyard. The Balakid Recovery. you know, eat to extinction, exile target creature or planeswalker, look at the top card of your library, you may put that card in your graveyard. Maul in for some more spot removal. And this is a very interesting one here because I don't feel like a lot of people play it. But whenever we play a land, we get to put a loyalty counter on her. We tap one, make a land we control 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace, which is interesting compared to the other Nissa. We can -5. We can put a creature card from look for mana cost less than or equal to the number of cards we control onto the battlefield from our graveyard, our hand or graveyard, with 2+1/+1 counters on it. So we got some interesting cards in there. We can get things like Elder Gargaroth, you know, Beanstalk Giant. It's definitely a card that, you know, when you get to that -5, it's something we're not going to do immediately, but it's something we could eventually do if our opponent's starting to kill off our things. You know, we got some Shadow's Verdict, which is another interesting card here. Definitely a very big rogue disruption card. It essentially that it exiles all creatures and planeswalkers with command cost 3 or less from the battlefield, and all creatures and planeswalkers with command cost 3 or less from all graveyards. So essentially, it's just removing like a lot of your aggressive style, you know, cards off the battlefield completely. And then essentially we have the advantage because we, you know, we have the Beanstalk Giants and Elder Gargaroths to kind of take advantage of that. And then of course we got the Crawling Barons in the deck as a one of, but then we got the mana here. Definitely interesting deck. You may be like, oh, that's not a lot of mana, but the mana's in like the mortal lands that we have there. So essentially that's the way we're going to kind of like get over the top. It's definitely a very interesting deck to try out just because of how aggressive it is on trying to get to that top end and kind of keep like the lower end off the battlefield. Because essentially if we can get to like a Shadow's Verdict, it definitely can like disrupt what a completely disrupt what a, you know, your opponent who's playing rogues is kind of doing, or playing something aggressive. Like one Shadow's Verdict just kind of ruins the game for like those kind of style decks, and then essentially allows us to kind of like get into that more top end. And then the sideboard, if you want to like switch it around depending on how your matchups go. The rest is, I feel like, not very good in the best of one, just because it's very like, if you're playing against something, if you play like you're playing against a lot of control, the rest is good. But if you're playing against a lot of creature heavy decks, the rest isn't great. Soulguide Lantern, if you feel like you're playing a deck that's trying to put things in their graveyard, it's definitely good because you can always like remove a graveyard, especially against like Cyclone. But I don't feel like you play a lot of Cyclone, but every now and then you do. Another Perdition, just in case you want to add more Perditions, if you feel like this is a card that you really want to play more of. Barrier Breach, if you're playing against a lot of enchantments, which I feel like a lot of people aren't really playing, but you know, it's just one of those things. If you want to get rid of enchantments, Massacre Worm, if you feel like you're playing a lot of smaller creatures, you can always swap in some Massacre Worms, maybe do a one of like Elder Gargaroth and a Massacre Worm if you feel like that's like the combo. And then we got Cragplague Baloth, which is another card here. Essentially it's hexproof, it has haste. It costs 7 mana, which is kind of expensive, but it can't be countered, and if it was kicked in, just battlefield of 4+1/+1 counters on it. So essentially it's a 10/10 hexproof haster for 10 mana. It's maybe playable. We don't have a lot of ramp. We do have some with like the Beanstalk Giant, but essentially there's not a lot of ramp in the deck. But it's something you can always think about playing. Maybe if you feel like you're playing against a lot of like rogues, it's something that's definitely anti-rogue because rogues can't really counter it or deal with it, except unless they block it and kill it that way. But essentially that's the only way you really can deal with it. But overall, it's a very interesting deck, and this is something that I definitely want to try out and play a lot more of. Just kind of get a feel of it and see what I may want to shift and, you know, change it up and see how it really does against like the style of, you know, decks that are currently out there in the meta. So I mean, overall, guys, I mean, these are some more decks that I, you know, kind of came across that I find very interesting, that are definitely very good decks that are very anti-meta. They definitely put up some good results based on where I found them. So these are definitely decks that I'm going to try out and try to post on the channel. Like I said, I do apologize yet again that I haven't been posting a lot of content. Like I said, I got myself weirdly addicted to more World of Warcraft, but I'm slowly not playing as much as I was, so we'll definitely get better and getting back into, you know, doing more Magic videos on the channel. So if you like the video, guys, hit that like button. I definitely appreciate it. If you want to post more, if you want to know I post more videos, hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next video.